In 1953, a young station chief sat in a villa in Tehran watching a country slide toward chaos. The streets were filled with protesters. The government was paralyzed. And in the span of just 4 days, an operation that had seemed doomed to failure would succeed beyond anyone's expectations. It would topple a democratically elected prime minister, restore an exiled monarch to absolute power, and set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the Middle East for the next 70 years. The operation was called Ajax. It cost less than $1 million, it required no American soldiers, and it would become the template for decades of covert intervention across the region. But the architect of that operation, the man who pulled the strings and bribed the mobs, was haunted by what he had done. Years later, near the end of his life, he would say that overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh was his greatest regret, that the coup in Iran had set America on a path that led directly to the Islamic Revolution, the hostage crisis, and endless conflict. This is the story of how the CIA redrew the Middle East, not with armies or diplomacy, but with cash, propaganda, and the conviction that America had the right to determine who ruled in distant capitals. It begins in Iran, but it doesn't end there. The logic of intervention, once unleashed, spread like a contagion across the entire region, and the consequences are still unfolding today. To understand why the CIA targeted Mossadegh, you have to understand oil. In the early 20th century, the Middle East was an afterthought in global politics. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed. European powers carved the region into mandates and protectorates. And beneath the sand, geologists were discovering the largest petroleum reserves on Earth. Iran was no exception. In 1901, the British government engineered a concession that gave the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later British Petroleum, exclusive rights to Iranian oil. The terms were obscene. Iran received just 16% of net profits. The British took the rest. Iranian workers lived in squalor, while British executives enjoyed luxury compounds. And the Iranian government had no access to the company's financial records. They had to trust British accountants to report the numbers honestly. For decades, Iran accepted this arrangement because it had no choice. The British controlled the infrastructure. They operated the refineries. They commanded the tanker fleets. Without British expertise, Iranian oil stayed in the ground. But after World War II, the mood shifted. Across Asia and Africa, colonial subjects were demanding independence. And in Iran, a new kind of leader emerged. Mohammad Mossadegh was not a revolutionary. He was a Swiss-educated lawyer, a member of the Iranian aristocracy, and a fervent nationalist. He believed that Iran's oil belonged to Iran, that a sovereign nation had the right to control its own resources. And in 1951, as prime minister, he did something that shocked the world. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The British were furious. They imposed a naval blockade to prevent Iran from exporting oil. They froze Iranian assets in British banks. They organized an international boycott of Iranian petroleum. The goal was to strangle the Iranian economy until Mossadegh was forced to capitulate. But he refused. He took his case to the United Nations. He rallied the Iranian people, and he became a symbol of resistance against Western imperialism. In London, the government of Winston Churchill demanded action. They wanted Mossadegh removed. They wanted the oil concession restored. And they wanted a leader in Tehran who would be compliant. So they turned to their closest ally, the Americans. At first, Washington hesitated. President Truman was sympathetic to Mossadegh. He saw him as a reformer trying to modernize a backward country. He refused British requests for a coup, but in 1953, Truman left office. Dwight Eisenhower became president, and with him came a new foreign policy team that saw the world through the lens of the Cold War. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, believed that any challenge to Western interests was, by definition, communist-inspired. It didn't matter that Mossadegh was not a communist. It didn't matter that he was suppressing the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh. What mattered was that he had defied the West, and in the zero-sum logic of the Cold War, that made him an enemy. The Dulles brothers convinced Eisenhower that if Mossadegh remained in power, Iran would fall to the Soviets. They argued that the oil crisis had weakened the Iranian economy, creating conditions ripe for communist takeover. They warned that losing Iran would topple the dominoes across the Middle East. It was a fantasy, but it was a fantasy that justified intervention. The CIA began planning Operation Ajax. The man chosen to lead it was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He was 37 years old, charming, well-connected, and utterly confident in America's right to engineer regime change. He flew to Tehran with a suitcase full of cash and a plan to turn the Iranian people against their own government. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Bribe the military, pay opposition politicians, hire mobs to create chaos in the streets, then blame Mossadegh for the instability and present the Shah, who had fled to Rome, as the savior who would restore order. It was a screenplay written in Washington and performed in Tehran. Roosevelt moved through the city like a ghost. He met with military officers in safe houses. He distributed $100 bills to newspaper editors. He hired thugs to pose as Mossadic supporters and attack mosques, turning religious conservatives against the government. He organized counter-protests that filled the streets with crowds chanting for the Shah. And he coordinated with General Fazl al-Zahedi, a former Nazi sympathizer who the CIA had chosen to replace Mossadic. The first attempt failed. The Shah issued a royal decree dismissing Mossadic, but the Prime Minister refused to step down. His supporters took to the streets. The military wavered. The Shah panicked and fled the country. It looked like the coup had collapsed. Roosevelt was ordered to evacuate, but he refused. He believed he could still turn the situation around. And he was right. On August 19, 1953, everything changed. Mobs funded by the CIA poured into the streets. They marched on government buildings. They overwhelmed Mossadeg's guards. And with the military standing aside, General Zahedi announced that he was the new prime minister. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah returned from exile, and Iran's brief experiment with democracy was over. The American press celebrated the Shah's return as a popular uprising. Time magazine put him on the cover. The CIA presented Roosevelt with a medal, and for the next 25 years, the Shah ruled as an absolute monarch, backed by American money, American weapons, and American training for his secret police, the SAVAK. The oil concession was renegotiated. British Petroleum retained a share, but now American companies got a piece of the prize. 40% of Iranian oil was controlled by a consortium that included Standard Oil and Gulf Oil. Iran remained a source of cheap energy for the West, and Washington had a loyal ally guarding the Persian Gulf. But the cost of that loyalty was hidden. The Shah's regime was brutal. Political dissidents were tortured, protests were crushed, and the resentment against American interference festered beneath the surface. In 1979, that resentment exploded. The Islamic Revolution swept away the Shah and brought to power a theocratic regime that defined itself by opposition to the United States. The hostages, the embassy siege, the decades of confrontation, it all traces back to 1953. Kermit Roosevelt understood this. Late in his life, he wrote that the coup had been a mistake, that America had destroyed a democratic government to protect oil profits, that the blowback had been inevitable. But by then, the lesson was already learned by a generation of CIA officers. Regime change worked. It was cheap, deniable, and effective. And the Middle East offered endless opportunities to practice. The success in Iran emboldened the CIA to try again. In 1956, they turned their attention to Syria. The government in Damascus was flirting with the Soviet Union. Worse, it was advocating for Arab nationalism and threatening to undermine pro-Western regimes in Jordan and Iraq. The CIA decided Syria needed a new government. The plan was cruder than Ajax. They would arm opposition groups, stage a border incident to justify military intervention, and install a military strongman loyal to Washington. But the operation leaked. Syrian intelligence uncovered the plot. 3 American diplomats were expelled, and the coup collapsed before it even began. The failure was an embarrassment, but it didn't stop the CIA from trying elsewhere. That same year, the agency became involved in Egypt. Gamal Abdel Nasser had taken power and was challenging British and French influence in the region. When he nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel invaded. The United States, fearing Soviet intervention, forced them to withdraw. But the CIA never forgave Nasser for his defiance. They spent the next decade trying to undermine him, funding his opponents and spreading propaganda against Arab nationalism. Then came Iraq. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party, with CIA support, launched a coup against General Abdul Karim Qasim. Qasim had pulled Iraq out of the Baghdad Pact, the Western alliance designed to contain the Soviet Union. He had threatened to nationalize oil, and he had allowed the Iraqi Communist Party to gain influence. That made him a target. The CIA provided the conspirators with lists of suspected communists. After the coup, the new regime used those lists to carry out a purge. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed. It was a bloodbath. But Washington celebrated because Iraq was back in the Western camp. The fact that one of the young Baathists who participated in the coup was named Saddam Hussein seemed irrelevant at the time. The pattern repeated across the region. Ally with autocrats, undermine nationalists, treat any government that pursued an independent foreign policy as a threat. The CIA wasn't interested in democracy or human rights. It was interested in stability, which meant governments that aligned with American strategic interests. But each intervention created new problems. The overthrow of Mossadegh led to the Islamic Revolution. The support for the Ba'ath Party in Iraq eventually empowered Saddam Hussein, who would invade Kuwait and become America's enemy. The arming of Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets created the conditions for the rise of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Every solution planted the seeds of the next crisis. By the 1970s, the Middle East was a chessboard of American client states, Soviet allies, and simmering resentments. The CIA had redrawn the political map, but the new borders were drawn in blood and grievance. Populations that had briefly tasted self-determination were ruled by dictators who stayed in power through American support. And beneath the surface, a counter-narrative was building. Islamic fundamentalism emerged not as a return to the past, but as a response to the present. Young men in Cairo, Tehran, and Riyadh looked at their rulers and saw puppets of the West. They saw corruption, inequality, and repression justified in the name of modernization. And they concluded that the problem wasn't just their governments, it was the foreign power propping them up. The Iranian Revolution was the first crack in the system, but it wasn't the last. In 1983, a truck bomb destroyed the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 Americans. The attack was carried out by Hezbollah, a group born out of resistance to Israeli occupation, but fueled by rage against American intervention. The message was clear. The Middle East was pushing back. The CIA's greatest miscalculation was believing that you could engineer political outcomes without consequences, that you could install leaders, fund insurgents, and reshape nations as if they were pieces on a game board. But people are not pieces, and history doesn't forget. The Middle East today is still living with the legacy of those choices. The distrust of the West, the appeal of anti-American ideologies, the cycle of intervention and blowback. It all connects back to the moment when Kermit Roosevelt handed out cash in Tehran and decided that America knew better than Iranians who should rule Iran. There's a bitter irony in the fact that the same tools the CIA used to fight Soviet influence, coups, propaganda, proxy forces, are now used against the United States. The playbook was copied, the methods were refined, and the Middle East became a battleground where everyone claimed to be fighting for justice while pursuing power. The CIA didn't act out of malice. They acted out of ideology. They believed that American interests and global stability were the same thing, that any government hostile to Washington was, by definition, a threat, and that the ends, containing communism, securing oil, maintaining influence, justified the means. But the means created a region where democracy was viewed as a Western conspiracy, where nationalism was crushed in favor of compliant autocrats, and where generations grew up believing that their suffering was the price of someone else's security. Operation Ajax wasn't just about oil, it was about control, the belief that the world could be managed, that outcomes could be predetermined, and that American power gave America the right to decide the fate of nations. That belief didn't die with the Cold War. It continued through the Gulf War, the Iraq invasion, and the War on Terror. The CIA redrew the Middle East, but the map they drew was never stable. It was built on resentment, on repression, and on the fiction that you can rule people without their consent as long as you do it quietly. And now, 70 years later, the region is still trying to draw its own map. Kermit Roosevelt died believing he had made a terrible mistake. The question is whether anyone learned from it.